In the rolling hills of southwestern Pennsylvania, the small town of Uniontown lay quiet under a soft autumn haze. The year was 1880, and the Marshall family home, a sturdy brick house on a tree-lined street, saw the daily rhythms of a middle-class household. Young George Catlett Marshall, a shy boy with a serious expression, often sat by the window watching the coal wagons rumble past, their drivers bundled against the chill. His father, a prosperous coal merchant, valued discipline and order, while his mother nurtured a gentle, reflective side in her son. Yet school did not come easily to George. He struggled with lessons, his mind wandering to the woods and fields beyond the classroom. The faint smell of coal smoke and the creak of floorboards in that old house would linger in his memory, a grounding backdrop to a life that would later span continents and command armies. At 16, George made a decision that surprised his family. He would attend the Virginia Military Institute. His older brother Stuart, already a WWII graduate, scoffed at the idea, certain that George lacked the mettle. But that doubt only hardened the boy's resolve. In September 1897, he arrived at the Lexington campus, its crenellated barracks and parade ground bathed in the golden light of late summer. The institute was a world of strict regimen, where cadets rose before dawn to the sound of bugles echoing across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Marshall, tall and thin, faced the infamous hazing of the rat year with a quiet endurance that impressed his tormentors. One night, forced to hold a bayonet over his head for an extended period, he refused to cry out even as his arms trembled and blood dripped from a wound. That silent fortitude became his hallmark, a lesson that suffering could be endured and overcome through sheer will. His academic performance was unremarkable. He never shone in the classroom, but on the drill field and in tactical exercises, he found his footing. The daily routine of inspections, formations, and study in the gas-lit halls of the barracks instilled a methodical approach to every task. He learned to observe, to listen, and to plan before acting. In the mess hall, over simple meals of bread and stew, he absorbed the stories of upperclassmen who had served in the Spanish-American War, their tales of distant islands and jungle marches kindling a quiet ambition. The Institute's architecture, with its fortress-like walls and arched sally ports, seemed to mold his character as much as its curriculum, forging a sense of duty and an unshakable calm. After graduating in 1901, Second Lieutenant Marshall entered a small, scattered army that was still policing the remnants of the frontier and newly acquired territories. His first posting took him to the Philippines, where the tropical heat hung heavy over the bamboo barracks and the air smelled of wet earth and frangipani. He led patrols through rice paddies and dense forests, learning to read terrain and manage men under the strain of climate and isolation. Later, at Fort Reno in Oklahoma, he served at an infantry post where the wind swept endlessly across the prairie, and the daily routine of drill, map reading, and equipment maintenance sharpened his logistical mind. He saw how poor supply planning could break a unit's spirit, and he began to develop the meticulous attention to detail that would define his career. A turning point came in 1906, when he attended the Infantry Cavalry School at Fort Leavenworth. The school's red brick buildings and manicured grounds housed the Army's brightest minds, and here Marshall's latent talents blossomed. He threw himself into the study of tactics, logistics, and military history, often working late into the night by the glow of an oil lamp. His instructors noted his ability to distill complex problems into clear, actionable plans. He finished first in his class, a quiet triumph that earned him a staff assignment and the respect of senior officers. The experience taught him that preparation and intellect could overcome any initial disadvantage, a principle he would carry forward. The years that followed were a slow accumulation of experience. He served as an instructor at the Army service schools, where his lectures on military organization were models of clarity. At Fort William McKinley in the Philippines again, and later at posts in the American West, he dealt with the mundane challenges of garrison life, training recruits, maintaining equipment, and keeping morale high in dusty outposts where the nearest town was a day's ride away. Through it all, He cultivated a reputation for absolute honesty and a refusal to engage in the political gamesmanship that often plagued the officer corps. By the eve of World War I, George Marshall was a seasoned captain, his hair already thinning, his bearing calm and deliberate, shaped by decades of quiet, persistent effort. The First World War brought George Marshall to France, not as a frontline commander, but as a staff officer whose brilliance with plans and logistics would shape the American Expeditionary Forces. In the summer of 1917, he arrived at the port of St. Nazaire, where gray ships unloaded endless crates of supplies onto rain-slicked docks. The air smelled of salt, coal smoke, and damp wool. Marshall, now a major, was assigned to the 1 SD Division's operations section, working in a makeshift headquarters, a requisitioned French farmhouse with peeling wallpaper and a fireplace that smoked. There, by the light of kerosene lamps, he drafted movement orders for the first American offensives. His meticulous maps and clear directives earned the notice of General John J. Pershing, who once famously dressed down a group of officers only to be met with Marshall's calm, factual rebuttal. That moment of candor, rare in a world of deference, marked Marshall as a man of integrity. After the armistice, Marshall served as Pershing's aide-de-camp, living in a Paris townhouse where the mornings were filled with the clatter of typewriters and the aroma of strong coffee. He helped write the after-action reports that would shape the Army's future doctrine, learning firsthand the complexities of coalition warfare. But the interwar years were lean. The Army shrank, budgets evaporated, and officers stagnated in rank. Marshall spent 5 years as a lieutenant colonel, moving between posts like Fort Benning, Georgia, where the humid air hung heavy over the pine forests, and the Army War College in Washington, D.C. At Benning, as assistant commandant, he revolutionized infantry training, emphasizing small unit initiative over rigid drill. He walked the training fields daily, his uniform crisp despite the heat, observing exercises and taking notes in a small leather-bound book. The work was unglamorous, but foundational, building the cadre that would lead in the next war. In 1936, Marshall was promoted to brigadier general and sent to command the 5th Brigade at Vancouver Barracks in Washington state. The post, nestled between the Columbia River and the snow-capped Cascade Range, offered a quiet interlude. He lived in a modest white clapboard house with a view of Mount Hood, where he and his wife Catherine tended a garden of roses. Each morning, he walked to his office along tree-lined paths, the distant sound of riverboats a gentle backdrop. Here, he managed the Civilian Conservation Corps camps, gaining experience in large-scale logistics and the handling of young men from diverse backgrounds. The work reinforced his belief in the potential of ordinary Americans when given clear purpose and solid leadership. By 1938, the storm clouds over Europe were unmistakable. Marshall was called to Washington to head the War Plans Division, working in the old munitions building on Constitution Avenue. The office was cramped, its windows overlooking a courtyard, but the work was immense. He and a small staff drafted the initial plans for a massive army expansion, working late into the night as the news from Europe grew darker. Marshall's methodical nature and refusal to panic impressed President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At a crucial White House meeting, when others nodded along with the president's ideas, Marshall bluntly stated his disagreement, earning Roosevelt's respect rather than his ire. That honesty, coupled with his proven planning skills, made him the logical choice for the top job. On September 1, 1939, the same day German tanks rolled into Poland, George C. Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The ceremony took place in the War Department, a simple oath administered in a wood-paneled office as the gravity of the moment settled over the room. Outside, the streets of Washington were quiet, the late summer sun casting long shadows on the marble facades. Marshall, now a 4-star general, faced an army that ranked 19th in the world, with fewer than 200,000 men and outdated equipment. Yet his first act was not to demand weapons, but to assess the nation's industrial capacity, understanding that modern war was won by logistics as much as by valor. He began the long, patient work of building the force that would liberate continents, his calm demeanor a steadying influence in a capital that was slowly awakening to the scale of the challenge ahead. On a quiet September morning in 1939, the streets of Washington, D.C. were bathed in the soft golden light of early autumn. The leaves of the elms lining the War Department building were just beginning to turn, and the air carried the crisp promise of change. Inside, a tall, reserved man with a steady gaze assumed the role of Army Chief of Staff, on the very day German tanks rolled into Poland. George Catlett Marshall stepped into his office not with a grand speech, but with the quiet, methodical determination that would define his leadership through the most devastating conflict in human history. The office itself was modest, filled with maps and papers, reflection of the man who valued substance over style. From that day, his life became a relentless rhythm of early morning briefings, late-night memoranda, and the immense burden of transforming a peacetime army of fewer than 200,000 men into a force of millions capable of fighting across the globe. Marshall's first and most urgent task was expansion. The U.S. Army in 1939 ranked roughly 19th in the world, behind even Portugal. With Congress and a public still wary of foreign entanglements, Marshall had to build not just an army, but the political will to support it. He worked with a quiet intensity, often standing before congressional committees, his erect posture and unflinching honesty earning respect across the aisle. He oversaw the construction of training camps that sprouted across the American landscape, from the pine forests of North Carolina to the deserts of California. These camps were miniature cities of wood and canvas, where civilians from farms and factories learned the rhythms of military life. The sound of marching boots on gravel, the smell of chow halls, and the sight of endless rows of barracks under wide skies became the backdrop of a nation arming itself. Marshall's genius lay not just in numbers, but in selecting the right leaders. He kept a small black notebook, in which he meticulously noted the names of promising officers, men he would later elevate to command: Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, shaping a generation of leaders with his keen eye for character over charisma. As the Army grew, so did the complexity of global strategy. Marshall's days were spent in the map room, a quiet, dimly lit chamber where the walls were covered with charts tracking the movements of ships, divisions, and supplies across every theater. He insisted on a Germany-first strategy, understanding that the industrial might and military prowess of Nazi Germany posed the most immediate threat to civilization. This required constant coordination with British counterparts, often involving transatlantic flights through dangerous skies to meet with Churchill and his generals. The relationship was not always easy. Churchill favored peripheral operations in the Mediterranean, while Marshall pushed relentlessly for a direct cross-channel invasion. The debates were intense, but Marshall's calm, reasoned persistence, combined with his refusal to engage in personal animosity, kept the alliance intact. He understood that war was not just a clash of arms, but a complex web of industrial production, logistics, and human endurance. He visited factories where women riveted fuselages and men poured steel, the glow of furnaces reflected in his spectacles, knowing that the true arsenal of democracy was the American worker. The weight of command was etched into Marshall's daily life. He rose at dawn, often taking a brief ride on his horse, a moment of solitude before the storm of the day. His office was a place of constant motion, yet he remained a center of stillness, listening more than he spoke. He refused to visit the Oval Office unless summoned, guarding the professional independence of the military. His wife, Catherine, provided a quiet domestic refuge, their home a place of simple meals and early bedtimes. Marshall's health was sustained by this discipline, but the strain was visible in the deepening lines on his face. He carried the burden of every casualty report, every telegram from the front, with a stoicism that masked a profound sense of responsibility. He once said that a commander must be able to see the suffering of his men without letting it cloud his judgment, a balance he maintained with extraordinary self-control. By 1944, the massive machine Marshall had built was ready. The invasion of Normandy was the culmination of years of preparation, a symphony of planning that involved millions of men, thousands of ships, and a deception operation of breathtaking audacity. Marshall had hoped to command the invasion himself, but Roosevelt, recognizing his indispensability in Washington, kept him at the strategic helm. On the night of June 5th, as paratroopers loaded into planes and landing craft churned in harbors, Marshall walked through the quiet corridors of the War Department, the weight of the moment palpable. The next morning, news of the landings came in fragments, and the building hummed with tension. Marshall's role was not on the beaches, but in the steady flow of reinforcements and supplies that followed, a logistical lifeline that stretched across the Atlantic. His vision extended beyond victory. He was already contemplating the peace, understanding that a stable post-war order required not just military defeat, but economic and political reconstruction. In the final months of the war, Marshall faced the grim task of sustaining momentum while preparing for the occupation of Germany. The discovery of the concentration camps added a moral urgency to the fight, and Marshall ensured that the evidence was documented and disseminated, believing that the world must never forget. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, the celebrations in Washington were muted by the knowledge that war still raged in the Pacific. Marshall immediately turned his attention to the invasion of Japan, a prospect that promised staggering casualties. The successful test of the atomic bomb in July presented a terrible but decisive alternative. Marshall, ever the pragmatist, supported its use to end the war swiftly and save lives on both sides. On the day of Japan's surrender, he stood on the steps of the War Department, the summer sun casting long shadows, a quiet figure amid the cheering crowds. He had transformed the U.S. Army into the most powerful military force on Earth, yet his thoughts were already on the fragile peace ahead and the long, difficult work of rebuilding a shattered world. In the waning days of 1945, as the world exhaled after years of war, George Marshall found himself in a new and unfamiliar landscape. The snow-covered streets of Washington had given way to the crowded, chaotic avenues of Shanghai and Nanking, where the air was thick with the smells of charcoal fires, incense, and the lingering tension of a nation on the brink. Marshall, now retired as Army Chief of Staff, had hoped for a quiet respite at his home in Leesburg, Virginia, tending his garden and enjoying the simple rhythms of civilian life. But President Truman had a different request. China, an ally during the war, was sliding into civil war between the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces of Mao Zedong. The task of preventing this collapse fell to Marshall, whose reputation for integrity and impartiality made him the world's most trusted envoy. He accepted the mission with a heavy heart, understanding that the odds of success were slim, but believing that even a chance at peace was worth the effort. Marshall arrived in China in December 1945, stepping off a military aircraft into the biting cold of a Nanking winter. The city was a study in contrasts. Ancient pagodas stood alongside bombed-out buildings, and rickshaws navigated streets filled with American jeeps. He set up his headquarters in a modest villa, where the days began with the soft light of morning filtering through paper screens, and the sound of birds in the courtyard mingled with the distant hum of a city struggling to recover. His daily routine was one of meticulous diplomacy. He met with Chiang in the ornate halls of the nationalist government, where silk robes and polished teak spoke of an old order clinging to power. He also traveled to the communist stronghold of Yan'an, a stark landscape of cave dwellings and peasant soldiers, where Mao received him with a shrewd, watchful hospitality. Marshall's approach was patient, methodical, and grounded in the belief that a coalition government, brokered through compromise, could avert catastrophe. For a brief moment, his efforts seemed to bear fruit. In January 1946, he secured a ceasefire agreement, and the guns fell silent across much of China. The news brought a flicker of hope to a war-weary world. Marshall worked tirelessly, shuttling between factions, drafting proposals, and using his calm authority to keep the talks alive. He walked the streets of Nanking in the evenings, a tall, solitary figure in a trench coat, observing the life of the city, the street vendors selling steaming noodles, the children playing in the rubble, the endless flow of refugees seeking safety. He understood that peace was not just a matter of political agreements, but of restoring the daily fabric of life. Yet beneath the surface, the truce was fragile. Both sides used the lull to rearm, and deep-seated mistrust festered. Marshall's own notes from this period reveal a growing frustration. He was a military man accustomed to clear chains of command, now immersed in a conflict where ideology, history, and personal ambition defied rational solution. As 1946 wore on, the ceasefire unraveled. Skirmishes broke out in Manchuria, and the negotiations became a theater of blame. Marshall's health suffered under the strain. The constant travel, the rich and unfamiliar food, and the emotional toll of witnessing a nation tear itself apart left him exhausted. He continued to press for a political settlement, but the United States was simultaneously providing limited aid to the nationalists, a contradiction that undermined his impartiality. The architecture of his diplomatic efforts, the conference rooms with their heavy curtains and stale tobacco smoke, the endless cables to Washington, became a backdrop to failure. He realized that the conditions for peace simply did not exist. The nationalists were corrupt and overextended, losing the support of the peasantry, while the communists were disciplined and ideologically committed to total victory. Marshall's greatest limitation was not a lack of skill, but the intractability of the situation. No amount of external mediation could resolve a civil war rooted in decades of social upheaval and foreign invasion. In January 1947, Marshall finally admitted defeat and returned to the United States. The journey home was a quiet, reflective one. As his plane crossed the Pacific, he gazed down at the vast, empty ocean, a metaphor perhaps for the gulf between his hopes and the reality he left behind. He issued a candid statement blaming both sides for the failure, a final act of honesty that angered many, but preserved his integrity. The China mission is often viewed as the one great setback in a career of remarkable achievements. Yet it taught Marshall valuable lessons about the limits of power and the necessity of addressing the underlying economic and social causes of conflict, lessons he would soon apply on a grand scale as Secretary of State. The experience in China, with its crowded streets, its ancient sorrows, and its stubborn refusal to bend to even the best intentions, deepened his understanding of a world far more complex than any battlefield. He returned to a nation preparing for a new kind of struggle, carrying with him the weight of a peace that could not be won. In the cold, damp spring of 1947, the streets of European cities lay in ruin. The war had ended 2 years earlier, but the scars remained: shattered buildings, idle factories, and empty market stalls. In Paris, families huddled in apartments with broken windows, patched with cardboard. In Berlin, women queued for hours for a loaf of bread. Across the continent, the machinery of daily life, trains, power plants, farms, had ground to a halt. It was against this bleak backdrop that George Marshall, now serving as President Truman's Secretary of State, stepped onto the world stage with a plan that would reshape history. The man who had spent the war years in Washington, poring over maps and troop deployments, now turned his disciplined mind to the architecture of peace. He understood that economic despair was a breeding ground for extremism, and that America's security was tied to the recovery of its former allies and adversaries alike. Marshall's journey to this moment began with his appointment as Secretary of State in January 1947. He brought with him the same quiet, methodical approach that had defined his military career. His office in the Old State, War and Navy building was a model of orderly efficiency. Here, he reviewed reports from diplomats and economists, each one painting a darker picture of Europe's condition. The winter of 1946 to 47 had been brutally cold. Coal shortages left millions shivering. Industrial production was at a fraction of pre-war levels, and the agricultural yield was insufficient to feed the population. The humanitarian crisis was immense, but Marshall saw beyond immediate relief. He recognized that without a comprehensive recovery plan, the fragile democracies of Western Europe might collapse, either into chaos or under the influence of the Soviet Union. The conception of what would become the Marshall Plan was not a sudden flash of inspiration, but a gradual crystallization of ideas within his team. In the spring of 1947, a pivotal meeting took place in a modest conference room in Washington. Marshall gathered his closest advisors, George Kennan, with his deep understanding of Soviet intentions, William Clayton, a businessman-turned-diplomat who had witnessed Europe's desperation firsthand, and Charles Bolin, a skilled Soviet expert. They discussed the failed efforts of piecemeal aid and the need for a bold, integrated program. Marshall listened more than he spoke, his penetrating gaze fixed on each speaker. He insisted that the plan must be European-led, with the nations themselves taking the initiative to coordinate their needs and commit to mutual cooperation. This was not to be an American imposition, but a partnership for recovery. On June 5, 1947, Marshall chose an unlikely venue to unveil his vision, the commencement ceremony at Harvard University. Standing before the assembled graduates and faculty in the warm afternoon light, he delivered a speech that was characteristically understated. In just under 12 minutes, he outlined the dire situation in Europe and proposed that the United States provide assistance to any nation willing to help itself. His words were simple but profound. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. There was no cheering crowd, no dramatic applause. The speech was barely noticed by the American press. But in Europe, where it was broadcast and transcribed, it ignited a spark of hope. The foreign ministers of Britain and France moved swiftly, organizing a conference in Paris to draft a joint recovery program. The implementation of the European Recovery Program, as it was officially called, was a monumental undertaking. In the sunlit halls of the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, representatives from 16 nations gathered to hammer out the details. They argued over allocations, priorities, and the mechanics of cooperation. Meanwhile, in Washington, Marshall navigated a skeptical Congress. He testified before committees, his calm demeanor and factual precision winning over lawmakers who were wary of foreign entanglements. The plan was not charity, it was an investment. Over 4 years, from 1948 to 1952, the United States provided over $13 billion in aid, equivalent to more than $100 billion today. This money flowed into rebuilding railways in France, modernizing steel mills in Germany, reclaiming farmland in Italy, and restoring ports in the Netherlands. It was not just about money, but about technical expertise and the transfer of American industrial and agricultural knowledge. On the ground, the effects were transformative. In a small factory in the Ruhr Valley, new machinery arrived in wooden crates stamped with the American eagle. Workers, who had been idle for months, returned to their posts, the hum of production filling the air once more. In the countryside of Greece, tractors and fertilizers helped farmers coax wheat from the soil, easing the threat of famine. The plan also fostered a spirit of cooperation. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, established to administer the aid, forced former enemies to sit at the same table and plan for a common future. This collaboration laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union. The daily lives of ordinary Europeans began to improve. Children had milk to drink, homes had electricity, and markets bustled with goods that had been scarce for years. The lasting impact of the Marshall Plan extended far beyond economic statistics. By 1952, Western Europe's industrial production had surpassed pre-war levels by 35%. The plan had stabilized currencies, balanced trade, and restored confidence. But its most profound achievement was the creation of a stable, prosperous bloc of democracies that could resist both internal subversion and external pressure. The contrast with Eastern Europe, where Soviet-imposed regimes rejected the plan under Moscow's orders, became stark. The Iron Curtain that divided the continent was not just a political boundary, but an economic one. Marshall's vision had helped build a bulwark of peace. The plan was not without its critics. Some argued it served American economic interests, others that it deepened the Cold War divide, but its role in preventing a return to the chaos of the 1930s is undeniable. As Marshall himself later reflected, The true reward was seeing the lights come back on across Europe, one city at a time. The autumn of 1953 brought a gentle chill to the hills of Virginia, where George Marshall had retired to his beloved estate, Dodona Manor. The house, a modest Georgian-style home with ivy climbing its brick walls, overlooked a quiet garden that Marshall tended with his own hands. Here, far from the tumult of Washington and the battlefields of Europe, he found solace in the rhythms of nature, pruning roses, raking leaves, and watching the light fade over the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was 72 years old, his hair now white, his stride slower, but his eyes retained the clear, direct gaze that had commanded the respect of presidents and privates alike. It was in this serene setting that he received word that he had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 1953, an honor that recognized his role as the architect of the Marshall Plan. The news did not excite him. Instead, he reflected quietly on the millions of lives touched by the recovery program and on the work that remained undone. The Nobel Committee's decision was a departure from tradition. Marshall was the first professional soldier to receive the Peace Prize, a fact that stirred both praise and controversy. The citation lauded his efforts to revive Europe's economy and, in doing so, to lay the foundations for lasting peace. Yet, as Marshall prepared for the ceremony in Oslo, he was acutely aware of the world's fragile state. The Cold War had deepened, with the Korean War only recently ended by an uneasy armistice. The Soviet Union had rejected the Marshall Plan, forcing its satellite states to decline the aid, and the division of Europe seemed permanent. In his acceptance speech, delivered in the ornate hall of the University of Oslo on December 10, 1953, Marshall spoke with his characteristic honesty. He warned that economic aid alone could not guarantee peace, and that the world must find a way to resolve conflicts without the catastrophic weapons now in mankind's possession. The audience listened in respectful silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air like the winter chill outside. Marshall's retirement was short-lived. In 1950, as the Korean War escalated, President Truman had called him back to service as Secretary of Defense. Marshall, ever the dutiful soldier, accepted without hesitation. He moved into the Pentagon, where the vast corridors echoed with the urgency of war. His task was to rebuild the military after the rapid post-war drawdown, a process he had overseen himself in 1945 to 46. Critics later pointed to that demobilization as a factor in the early setbacks in Korea, arguing that Marshall had reduced the armed forces too quickly, leaving them ill-prepared. Marshall acknowledged the risks, but maintained that the public demand to bring the troops home had been overwhelming, and that a democratic nation could not maintain a wartime footing indefinitely. His tenure at defense was marked by the same methodical approach. He worked to increase troop levels, streamline procurement, and manage the difficult relationship with General MacArthur. The stress took a toll on his health, and in 1951 he retired for good, returning to his garden. In his final years at Dodona Manor, Marshall lived a life of quiet contemplation. He rose early, ate a simple breakfast, and spent his mornings reading history and biography. Visitors were few. He preferred the company of his wife, Catherine, and his memories. He rarely spoke of his wartime role, deflecting praise with a gruff modesty. When asked about his greatest achievement, he would often cite not the Marshall Plan or the victory in World War II, but his efforts to improve the Army's training system in the 1930s, which had saved countless lives. The garden became his sanctuary. He planted vegetables and flowers, finding in the soil a connection to the cycles of growth and renewal. The light through the trees, the sound of birds, the feel of the earth, these simple pleasures were a balm after decades of bearing the weight of nations. The legacy of George Marshall is a tapestry of constructive contributions, woven with threads of limitation. The Marshall Plan remains a landmark of enlightened statecraft, a model of how generosity and strategic interest can align to rebuild a shattered world. It demonstrated that security is not just a matter of armies, but of economic stability and hope. Yet, its reach was constrained by the Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe, under Soviet domination, was denied its benefits, and the continent remained divided for decades. Marshall understood this failure, though he placed the blame squarely on Soviet obstruction. His life also offers lessons in leadership, the value of candor, the discipline of preparation, the courage to make unpopular decisions, and the humility to serve without seeking glory. He was a man who never voted, believing a soldier should remain above politics, yet he shaped the political landscape of the 20th century more than most elected officials. On October 16, 1959, George Marshall passed away at Walter Reed Army Hospital. His funeral was a simple military ceremony at Fort Myer, followed by burial in Arlington National Cemetery. The autumn leaves were turning gold and red as the caisson carried his flag-draped coffin. Soldiers fired a salute, and a bugler played taps. The world he left behind was imperfect, scarred by new tensions, but it was also a world that had been given a chance to rebuild, to breathe, to hope. His gravestone is plain, bearing only his name, rank, and dates. But his true monument is in the thriving cities of Europe, the peaceful cooperation of former enemies, and the enduring idea that peace can be built, brick by brick, through patience, pragmatism, and a steadfast commitment to the common good.